This is the AlignUI website at alignui.com. The first thing that jumps out at me are these sort of corner elements and the lines. They're really hinting at the visual language of, well, Figma in this case, but design software. And so that's a nice way to add structure to the page and represent the concept of the product. One thing I quite like here is the selected state for these sort of tabs is this gradient line color. One thing I do wonder, because it's this linear gradient which goes from sort of transparent to fully saturated or fully opaque, non-transparent, it makes me wonder if they wanted to use it as a progress bar, and you can see it sort of filling up as it after you click on it. It makes me wonder if they wanted to use it as a progress bar for how long this tab would be showing, and couldn't quite make it work because it would work quite nicely as a progress bar. But it's also quite nice that it's got this animation anyway, and it's a good way to highlight the selected tab. I feel like I should point out the buttons, which have this sort of subtle depth effect on it. That's quite nice, but it's understated. They're not drawing too much attention to it. There's lots of interesting layering and visible structure effects going on here. So you can see these lines here on the left and right. They're used as these outlines for these elements, but then as they continue down into this dark container, they become this sort of glass effect outline around the video here. And even though you've got these sharp corners up here, they become these rounded corners down here inside the container. So that's quite a nice effect where they've had this transition happen and the same elements sort of get a different treatment once they're inside the container. There's that continuity. And I think there's a couple of examples of that throughout. One thing I find interesting here is this grid effect under the video. It feels a little bit out of place, and I think it fits the idea of a pixel grid, so it suits the concept. But apart from the grid in the background here, this grid effect feels sort of tighter, and I wonder if it's just there for visual effect, essentially. I suppose it also helps to highlight the this sort of glassy container around the video a bit more, because it provides a bit of background for this slightly lighter container to highlight. Again, you've got this these containers here. They sort of continue this this line that was started up here, but you've got this nice sort of subtle gradient effect with these dividers here. That's again quite a nice subtle way to wrap these numbers in a bit more structure. So you've got these lines between containers. I find those quite interesting, and that continues the same sort of visible structure we saw started at the top. So even when they stop it in this container because they maybe didn't want to keep it going so that it wouldn't interfere with the containers within the container, this left edge and this left edge, they wanted to not intersect with those. They continue it in the background. So that's quite nice. It's got this good continuity effect in terms of, okay, these are the margins of the page. They continue down even if you can't see them. Which makes it sort of a bit more interesting. I don't know if there's something I can't see here, but it makes it a bit more interesting that this container inside the other container doesn't line up with that edge. You can see there's a gap. And it might be that there's a very subtle, I think there's a shadow there, and maybe the shadow extends out to that level. But I find that interesting just because the containers inside this larger dark container do extend to that line, but this one doesn't. Having said that, I can see now that this video container does line up with this video container, so maybe they're just keeping that consistent. So again, you've got the these margin lines extending sort of behind the container again, as they did with the dark container. But again, in this case, they extend into this light blue container, which is quite nice. This becomes this grid. This helps to outline and structure the elements inside the grid. Again, here's some subtle depth effects. I quite like that this structure sort of gets introduced and is used to reinforce the alignment of these buttons on the right, so that you can see how everything in the container is laid out, sort of left and right sides, and that makes it feel all the more consistent and sort of orderly. And that line continues past this container, but then this one that was created as part of the grid in here, it doesn't continue past it, but you can see that it does sort of become the outside edge of this container. So there's quite a lot of interesting choices made here where the designers of the website have said, okay, we might not want to continue this element, but we're going to do something with it. I mean, you could see that up here. There's an interesting choice here where this line extends down here, even if you don't believe it continues the edge of this sort of glassy section. There's this line that sort of curves off to the left, and this one that curves off to the right. And so there's lots of interesting effects here involving movement and continuity that I find quite interesting. So this continues down here. You can see here this line stops, whereas this line continues. So lots of interesting effects here. That could have continued here to join this line as an intersection, but I guess it would have made less sense than these other two, because they continue all the way down. You can see here they've reversed the layout essentially. So you've got this text on the left and image and tabs on the right. They reverse that here, so the image is on the left, text is on the right. Normally this is a bit of a risky pattern because if the images are different sizes, different layouts, different shapes, as they are here, this is wider than this imagery section. It's quite hard to structure that in a way so it feels consistent, it feels balanced as you go to the left and the right. You alternate the content and the text. But in this case, because they've already set up this strong structure based on visible lines, it doesn't really matter because it still feels like a very structured layout, still feels like everything's in the right place. And so that's one of the benefits of having this extra visual structure. One thing they play with up here, and I think they do even more above, and actually they do it here as well, is they, with these lighter containers, they start with more saturation of color and they end up with lighter. So this point you can see is basically white at the bottom of this container. Down here they've got blue and it gets much lighter. Up here they've got this gray, it gets lighter, and then this green and it gets lighter towards the bottom. I quite like that because they're using the darker, more saturated color like the green or the gray or the blue at the top to introduce the container. By the time it's over, you don't necessarily need the color to be that strong, and you can see they're making use of it, a lighter color, by introducing things like these background patterns. They wouldn't stand out as much, or they would stand out too much if you had the darker color at the bottom and had to make them even higher contrast. So it's quite a nice combination where they're making it feel more gentle just in time for the next container to come in and have that more saturated color, so that the bottom of this blue container, for example, isn't competing as much with the top of this gray container. The bottom of this gray container isn't competing as much with the top of this green container. So they start with a strong color, make it a bit more subtle, a bit more gentle, a bit lighter as they get lower down, and that sets up for a nice introduction into the next container where the stronger color can be used. So I quite like here that this color is being used as sort of an introduction to the container, and then it fades away, when it's not needed as much. And this works mostly because you've got this this sharper border around the containers. That means that you're still certain of when the container finishes. So you don't need the color to be as strong in the background because you've got this sharp edge. Again, you can see it here, the darker, the more saturated yellow, and the lighter, the less saturated yellow at the bottom. And then they're using those lines that they've had running throughout the entire website and using it to create these sort of sections, these containers. And that's really nice because you can have these lines quite subtle when you don't need them so much, but they still continue down. And then suddenly they become useful and get used for this 3x2 grid without needing an extra container just to hold this. So you can still introduce that structure based on what you've had on the website all along. So that's quite nice. You can see that even more strongly here, this fading of color. So they start with this lighter gray and they end up completely white. And that means that this, by the time you get to this point, this purple really stands out compared to this, whereas if this was still a light grey, maybe the purple would stand out less. It's also quite nice, and maybe it's harder to see here, but it's a bit easier to see here. It's quite nice because you've got this lighter purple, which might take some attention away from the content, because colour usually sort of attracts attention. By the time it gets down here, you've got the lighter background, and it really puts focus on the testimonials here. Interestingly enough, here this container doesn't have the sharp edge, and actually it fades away completely, so that by the point you get to this bottom, you have no container at all, which is, you can see here, they faded away the background color, but they've still got this border around the container. At the bottom here, they've got rid of it completely, and I wonder if that's partly because they wanted to have the testimonials shine that much more. They're already in their own containers, so you don't need so much structure. You can also, as a minor point, you can also see here that the margin lines in the background sort of can't be seen at the top of this container. By the time the transparency kicks in, they start to be seen again. So that's quite a nice effect. Again, the more saturated, the less saturated. You can see here these corner effects. This background line is coming in here and curving away, and you might remember that was used in this section here. So the background line comes in, it curves away at the top edges. I don't have a great guess for why that is, but I quite like that they repeated that. You're sort of taking this first important container, and you know it's important because it's a darker color, whereas the rest of them are lighter colors. So you're taking this first container and you're having this pattern here at the top of the website, and then you're echoing that at the bottom of the website with the same pattern. And then you've got this final container with the footer, so you've still got the background structural lines coming in, and you can see them peeking at the bottom. So they're this ever-present thing. But inside the container, they've got all of these lines separating the large sort of sitemap in the footer, and so those ones don't come in again. They're just relying on these internal lines, which I quite like. This makes the whole footer section feel really organized, but it's still keeping that motif, that visual language of design software.